everybody, and welcome to Fraudible, the video podcast that brings together academics and practitioners to discuss all things fraud. In this episode, we're going to be discussing fraud and the media, and I am delighted to be joined by academic Professor Sebastian Oelrich and practitioner Cecilie Fjellhøy. Thank you so much both for joining me today. Sebastian, would you mind giving us a brief introduction into yourself and your work, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you.
Claire. So my name is Sebastian. I'm professor in management accounting at Aarhus University in Denmark, Aarhus Business School. And I'm particularly interested in anything that's got to do with organizational wrongdoing, especially different kinds of fraud. And recently I've become more invested in the way media portrays frauds and what they have to do with their perception of fraud.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Cecilia, the same to you, please.
Yes, thank you as well, Claire, for having me on this topic. Is super interesting for me because, yes, my background is that I am a victim of fraud. And if you've seen the Tinder Swindler, then you would know how bad it can actually become. I lost over £200,000 back in 2018. But after that, I went to the media. So that's why I'm a perfect person to talk about it from a personal angle. And after that, I then co-founded a nonprofit to help other romance fraud victims with NRO, so called Love Set. So that has kind of been my calling in life, helping others that they don't have to endure the same as I had to.
Excellent, thank you so much. So let's start off with you, Cecilia, then. So obviously there are going to be experiences that people have about fraud being portrayed in the media that are very positive, and then there are also going to be ones where there have been very negative. Have you seen a balance between the two, or has it mostly been positive or mostly been negative?
For me, it is that kind of duality of it that I think if it hadn't been for the media, where would I have been? It was the journalist that first took my case seriously because it was an insane case. And that was the first ones. The police didn't care, the banks didn't care. So I was like, well, I know what I experienced. So I'm very grateful that we have the media to tell these stories. What would have happened, and critique the system that is being set up. So for me, I've been lucky, hugely kind of positive in the way. But of course, I have been critical as well to kind of how even my fraud was kind of as the Tinder Swindler, and he was seducing women, and kind of it portrays a very simplistic image of what it really is and what happened. So I think for me that is the negative part, is the clickbaits that are being sometimes needed for people to go and read an article, and it's just being very easily portrayed as stupid people kind of fallen for it, as we've been talking a lot about the language here. So I think that has been sometimes tough to see, and that they want sometimes us, and that they sometimes want just a quick sit down on the couch for 10 minutes. And for me, these stories are hugely personal and very traumatic. There's not a lot of victims that would want. I was lucky that I had 2 days in a studio, that I could, tell my story properly. So I think sometimes the media are not really paying attention to how personal for a lot of people.
Yeah, and Sebastian, have you found the same with regards to how the corporate organisations are portrayed in the media? Is there that balance, or is there sort of that finger pointing type of culture in the media?
Yeah, so I totally agree with Cecilia's point of view. Like, on the one hand, without the media, we probably wouldn't see many of those frauds published in the first place. So the media is such an important, we sometimes call them watchdog, such an important actor in just detecting and even preventing frauds, because there's always the risk if you have a good media, if you have good investigative journalists, so that there's a high risk for fraudulent parties to be discovered, so they don't even do it in the first place.
Yeah.
So what we know is that, for example, the media has been such an important control actor in the detection of fraud. It's much more prevalent than any of the traditional actors that you would think about when it comes to corporate fraud, like when you think of auditors, who would be much more into of it, right? But the media has been very important. And for example, so what's especially for the smaller cases, what we've seen is that local newspapers are such an important source for us to get to know all this information. Like Cecile said, it's you have to have journalists who are interested in it, right? So they choose their stories as well. So if you have not large frauds, but small frauds that are only concerned with, in the corporate world, we're talking about a few 100,000, that's nothing, right? When it comes to fraud, we're talking about millions and billions usually. So for the small frauds, the big newspapers, they're usually not interested in. So you need those local ones. And we've seen in the past that when those local newspapers, when they close down, there's an increase in fraud in those areas. So they really play a very important role in detecting and preventing frauds, right? But on the other hand, I totally agree with Cecile that it's sometimes this infotainment, like there needs to be there needs to be a personal story, there needs to be, and we'll probably talk about this more in depth in a second. So the journalists, they choose their stories, and they have probably very different ways of why they choose a specific story. So some frauds, they are just not newsworthy in a way, right?
And because that is what I was going to say, is that I feel sometimes when I'm trying to get, media now to take up stories, that I know, they're, as you say, they pick their stories and they just know that this isn't, what's special about, like that they don't see kind of everything around and what fraud really is. So as you say, if the amounts isn't as big as mine, or there's like, what are the actual consequences here? What is the news story? And I think that has been, because there are a lot of frauds happening all the time. I had plenty of people coming to me now afterwards, how can I tell my story? How did you make 2 documentaries, and it's just difficult these days as well, because it happens so much. So when, like, what separates this story from the other story? And especially, as I was saying, like when I've been trying to get now the media to tell more about, why is it happening? For example, for myself, why could my fraud happen so easily? Why could I, what happened in the background here with the banks and the loans I was given? Why didn't the police do anything? And I was very disappointed after the Netflix documentary was released. If you go out there now, try to find an article or any evidence of any journalist all over the world asking questions, or like having an updated, like why didn't the police in Europe do more? Well, that's the questions we got from everyone. But there wasn't a single, after that, salaciousness of, diamonds and private jets and stuff has laid down, and then you're there like, why is it still out there? There was no wanting to take that story further on, which I think is super sad, because it's just going to continue happening, and that's what prevents. But if the system is set up for it, that is what I feel a lot of time for the frauds to happen. Yeah.
It's a very interesting point. I just did some research on the big Wirecard fraud scandal. It's been like the largest fraud scandal in German history. And I looked at about almost 1,000 media articles in the German newspapers. And what we found was that, like you just said, especially all those background information, right? How did it happen? How can it happen on a systemic level? How is the system set up for it? We find that very few newspapers report about those intricacies of fraud. And what they focus on, it's more that, I would call it infotainment or moral evaluation of it. You look at the, like you said, the private jets, right? You look at anything that you can make a good headline about. Yeah. And that's what you start to focus on. And it kind of, on the one hand, it's very important because it might resonate with the audience, right? So you can keep it in the newspapers. Like, I mean, a Netflix documentary about just how accounting happens. I mean, no one wants to watch that, right? But on the other hand, like in your case with Tinder and everything going on, it's just very sensational, and that's what they focus on. And that's important to keep it and to give it to audiences to make them relate to it, maybe. But on the other hand, it's also very important to not forget that there is something happening in the background that's on a systemic level usually, and we need to address that. But oftentimes the media just stops focusing on it because probably it doesn't sell.
Yeah, but can I say as well, I think it has the reason that why, in my opinion, why it sometimes stops is because we have very powerful actors that we are critiquing. Think about the multi-billion-dollar companies, and they can just say no. We know that they were in contact, you know, in my cases with the different, I'm not going to name the banks and everything, but if they don't want to talk to you, if they don't want to participate in a documentary, you don't have anyone, you need a whistleblower, and that takes a lot of energy, money, stakes for the, you know, for the makers of this. So they then decide, okay, they're not going to open their doors to us. They're not going to explain, you know, why they approved of this, or they gave out a credit card with a limit of 68,000 in 3 weeks. You know, it's damaging for them. It's easier for sometimes. So you need whistleblowers in these cases. And that is what I'm trying. I'm trying very hard, but it's not easy infiltrating these very powerful corporations. And for example, Tinder as well. Like, of course, is the reason why they're happy not. You know, that I said at the end of the documentary, I said it isn't Tinder's fault. You know, so they were quite happy about that. So yeah, they were happy about it. In my case, yes, they were not Tinder's fault, but I mean, there is their fault in so many cases. So I hate that I have that on it, because I'm like, now, 6 years later, I have a very different of opinion. But that is not being, you know, everyone thinks I don't critique them because of that. But I just saw it through the lens of my case and not as talking about the systemic of it.
Yeah. So do you think then that, because yes, I understand that all of these media companies need to promote the bigger stories because of the clickbait need. So is it possible to deduce then that the public aren't going to connect with those as much? Because if you think of someone who's lost hundreds of thousands of pounds to fraud, whereas actually it's very common that people might be defrauded out of, say, £50 to £100, say. Do you think that that's almost creating a barrier between the general public being able to connect with what fraud is and how it's perpetrated, because all they're going to see are these massively huge stories where hundreds of thousands up to millions of pounds are lost? Do you think there's that disconnect there?
I think it's just because fraud is so all-encompassing. You know, it is from a £50 and you on Facebook Marketplace, you never receive it, to, which I have to say, romance fraud, and we know corporate fraud as well. People have been taking their lives because of what's happened, and they, you know, that is, so it can have huge impacts. I think sometimes when you then hear the word fraud, okay, some people are just So I think that is where the disconnect sometimes happen. And I have to say, like, the media, especially here in the UK, every Valentine, me and Anna are being inundated. It's been so much, and all of them want stories. Can you give us 3 stories? Can you give us a victim? It's almost like they want us to just hand, victims on a silver platter to them so they can tell their stories. And a lot of times it is tabloids. And we don't want to do that because it's being told very simplistic. It's not a proper documentary. As I said, when I went, it really healed me going because they did their investigations. You know, I got to know that my fraudster were convicted fraudster already. You know, I got a lot of answers. But if, as a victim, you're going into the media with a very traumatic story, and I bet we're going to come into this as well, like the backlash that you're getting as well, when you then go public with your trauma that you're already blaming yourself for. We don't want to do that. We don't want to just give highly traumatized victims over to a tabloid that will tell their stories. You can even see it on Twitter. It was a week ago where there was a woman who came forward, and the comment section just filled up.
They were disgusting comments.
Yeah, it's and I we are sometimes, I feel, because we're in the fraud space, we are around people who understand fraud. We know the kind of mechanism. Oh my God, the social engineering that needs to be in place, for people to actually, click or do and transfer. So sometimes I feel, we come a long way, and then I go back to the real life, and I see that fraud isn't being taken seriously at all. And it's I don't know what, the media is a huge part of that.
Just like to come back to your point about the disconnect between the audience, right, and the frauds. What I've seen is that media is pretty good at connecting to the audience, especially in those huge cases where, of course, it's just so abstract. When you have shareholder losses, when you have those billions, when you have transactions that you don't understand in like 20 different countries and some shadow firms, right? What they do is, and that's obviously also a critique, they tell those personal stories that resonates with their audience. Especially what I've seen in the Wired cases, they focused in certain newspapers where they knew who their audience was. They focused on especially this group of victims. So they looked at the elderly, they looked at the ones who lost their pension funds because of the fraud. Whereas in another newspaper, like in the UK, that we looked at, they completely ignored all the German victims of the fraud, where the fraud was situated, where you had the most losses. And they focused exclusively on UK victims, right? Because why would a person from the UK be interested in how much Germans lost? And why would Germans be interested so much when something happens abroad, right, to other people? So they're really good at being very selective in the way they report, right, to get their message across to the audience and have them resonate with it. And then it often, like Cecilie explained, it can get into personal spaces that you rather not want to cross. You only do it in order to have some infotainment, right, which can be very problematic.
I totally agree with that, because I think that has been the most things that I've had journalists from different countries, and they always want, like, because for example, my foster's traveling to different countries. So I always get from journalists, do you know if he has any victims in Bulgaria? Do you know if he has any, like, Switzerland? It was always coming, he was in Bangkok as well. Like, do you know what he... So I totally agree, Sebastian. I can clearly see that it's very local, and they want kind of just local victims, which it sounds just so it's a hunt for it almost, that they need a local presence for it, for them to make a case about it. Which I kind of understand it, because that's just how we humans are. We are ourselves closest sometimes, and unfortunately that is how it is. But I think that is the issue as well, that when fraud is global, it goes across, the borders here. There are no borders in this. I think that is, I think maybe that was the most difficult, because it doesn't have sometimes a local sense, because the victims are maybe not even in the country where it's being started. So I think that is another reason why this is difficult for people to grasp, especially with And
I think what you were saying earlier, before the recording started, about how because of your background and your heritage and your upbringing, that you're in a more privileged position to be able to tell your story. And can you expand on that as well?
Yeah, because I've been reflecting a lot, kind of why the Tinder Swindler became such a success. This happens all the time. It wasn't, I really thought that, oh my God, these in-person romance fraudsters, it can't be a lot of them, and now I realize, it's tons of them, it's happening. And of course, globally, online romance fraud. But then I was like, why? What was it about this story? And I think it has to do with the privilege that mostly was from Scandinavia, or blonde, blue eyes, like people, when we tell our story, people tend to listen or think positively about even the country you're from. Like, we are a really trusting country, and like, oh, Norway's so great. I have a lot of times people ask me, why did you ever move away from Norway? What are you doing here? It's such a shame, because I can imagine how many stories there are from other parts of the world that might even be quite similar, and how many people would listen to them if they don't look or come from a certain part of the world. And I think that is something that I bring it with me now, and are rather using it. The Tinder Swindler is a door opener now, and I will use that, to actually get the word out. It's better than nothing, So I'm more like, I will try to speak for them that no one wants to listen to, but it's been something that I've felt sometimes bad about as well, that kind of just because the way you look in the country, shouldn't have to say if your story is worth telling,
Absolutely right. Sebastian, and do you find that that's a similar case with the organisations, in that if you have, say, like bigger banks, people might be more inclined to think negatively about them, whereas if you were to have a charity case, say, then might people feel more sympathetic? Is that something that you see in the organisational space as well?
Yeah, so we don't know that much about, especially NGOs. It's still a field that's not well researched, to be honest. But to add to what Cecilie just said, it's very interesting, and that's something that we're just starting to understand, is why something becomes a scandal, right? So why is the Tinder Swindler so big, whereas many other similar cases, they've not gotten any media attention, right? And it's the same for frauds. We have those billion-dollar insolvencies, but one of those just stays a simple insolvencies. You get 3 media newspaper articles out of it, and the other one becomes a huge scandal that you have half a year of reporting, with a single newspaper reporting like 300 articles on it. Right? So what are the ways that media actually makes the case a scandal? And I'm very much of the opinion that the media makes scandals. So we know this somewhere from the political sphere, right? So especially with right-wing and left-wing newspaper articles from the US, we often see that one simply portrays an issue. Now, especially with Trump, we see that quite blatantly. One simply reports this as a simple issue or a small issue, and the other one makes it into a huge scandal. So how do they make it a scandal, right? And I think one of the things is, like Cecilie really, really well explained on her own example, it's that resonant media framing. Like, you can get people to care about your case. You have a face that you could put in front, and a story that is interesting, that you can use a lot, right? And then you just, and that's what I mean with repeated media framing. If it's only interesting for a few days, you probably don't get anything out of it, and it simply stays the case. But if you can actually keep it in the media, in the news, and what we've seen is that the ones that keep in the news for a prolonged period of time, they're usually the ones where you have this huge infotainment value, right? And that can help the media to actually keep the audience captivated and engaged. I mean, because otherwise they have to move on as well. Even if they wanted to report more about the fraud, there's obviously shareholder incentives as well. They would have to go and report about something else, because people just don't click on it that much. But if you can keep them engaged, you can actually make it into a scandal. So I think it's also, from the other side, we as audience, I'd fault as well, because we are not that interested in news stories if they are not captivating enough, even though they're super relevant to us. I think it's both of those.
Yeah, because I think with the Tinder Swindler, because I think it was more of a now piece, and I think that was so captivating. Why I totally agree with you, Sebastian, because sometimes the stories are like, well, it happened already. I've had that I've been trying to get some, and it happened already. We want where it happens now, where we can follow the victim, And I was like, but a documentary is a documentary. We can't have live. That was so again. But I think that was so powerful with the Tinder Swindler, because people saw that he was out, People were like shocked at the end, he's out, So it was almost like a manhunt. Everyone was like, where is he? I got people who, thought he was in Spain, and like even in Australia, they were hanging up posters, like wanted posters of him. So like people were really, trying to catch him, And so I think that was the staying power sometimes. And it still is, he's still out there. He's still like posting stuff on social media. So it's doing his own, TV shows, appearances, So the story is so weirdly still alive, you know, especially for me, of course, but it's like, which a lot of others, I feel, sometimes it's done and dusted before it gets told and there isn't anything more. Or, you know, what I mean, like, you really have to dig quite hard for the journalists. And I think when they've written that first piece, most times they're just smaller pieces after that. They're not going to unlock, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to...
Totally agree. Just to add one more point to this, like we see that, again, I researched the Wirecard case, and what we see is now, because the CFO fled somewhere, and at some point they thought he was dead, and now he's reappearing in Russia somewhere. So we have all those posters around Europe with him, like with the beard, without the beard. So that's what actually is in the news most of the time. And then that there was a huge fraud, that's like just one line in the newspaper articles now, and everything else is about the CFO who fled and who has connections and who might have been a spy and who's connected to Central Intelligence agencies in Russia. So they put all the story around this, and that's kind of what kept it going, right? Like you said, I totally agree. It needs to be a story that's currently happening, right? To be of that much interest. Yeah. But it can also be very instrumental and helpful to just keep the audience engaged and to like put pressure on authorities as well to do something, right? Because it's still in the news and people are still interested about this case. And once no one's interested in anymore, then that's usually when the window for actual reforms is over.
I think that's what I was missing, was more like we had journalists asking us why he was still out there, and we threw it straight back to them, like, can you reach out to the police in your country or like in my country, I mean, like to ask them, and that they feel the pressure instead of asking us, because we're the ones who are getting a lot of questions about it. Why aren't we going after him? Why aren't we? I was like, well, it's not really up to us, and that has been maybe what I feel is hugely lacking, is that very critical lens. And that has been bugging me so hard as well, because I've had a lot of critical articles against the banks in Norway. And every time I say something, as a victim, as a bankrupt victim, I'm at the bottom here. If I say something that I say, well, I don't think their fraud, measures that they did was good enough, I had a lot of, but then I have then 8 banks that all are, they have a right to reply. So I say maybe it wasn't, but then I have 8 very powerful banks that can go and say, no, we have great measures. What I mean is, it feels like and I feel sometimes as well, like the questions that the journalists might ask one tough question, like, how could you do X? And then they reply, and there's no hard hitting questions. It's very softball with them. Like I'm feeling that is sometimes that I'm like, oh, come on, media. At least we're making an article, make it powerful then, Yeah. We have facts here in this case. And I think that has been sometimes so infuriating, because in my case, the banks don't want to talk to me. So what do you do when they just close the door? And then the journalists that they're speaking to as well, like they can just say no comment, So where are the proper critique here,
Yeah.
Like they're so powerful, they're too powerful, that they can allow themselves to just say no comment, or just say Cecilia's wrong, and then it's like, okay, fine. And it's a huge battle to be in. It's very, very tough, as a private person, that you have to stand in the firing line of very big, powerful banks who are saying that you're wrong, but you feel deep down inside something is not really right here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to and to briefly focus away from the written media, and briefly talk about the television interviews that you've done, Cecilia. There's one in particular that I shall be very careful with the words that I use. Do you find that like the visual and the audio media is more risky for a victim of fraud because of the presenter or the interviewer's own potential misconceptions on the topic?
Oh my God, yes. It's been, we know. It's more that they are misinformed, with stats that are coming out, that we know a lot of the stats that are out there aren't really reflecting the true numbers or who is the true victim. And then they get like a package from, a PR agency that says X, and then they just run with the story. And especially live TV, I have to say, is the worst. That is why we were on This Morning Before Christmas, and they wanted us to bring a victim, And I was like, I'm not going to bring a victim for an 8-minute sit down with 3 people. Like, that is, you don't have the time. So we said no to that. But live TV is the worst because you have so little time, and radio as well, super difficult to try to get your points across. And you have to be very PR savvy, which I luckily now after some years are. But if you think about it, if you just get thrown into this, it's not normal. So I have to say, a lot of those questionings, and they're very opinionated themselves a lot of the times because they like to talk. I feel like written journalists they like more to be in the background, and just tell the story. Or I feel some of the presenters, they love to have a long line of questioning where they have their own opinion to it and then they ask you. So I think that has been, but as I said, the documentary, the Tinder Swindler became a live medium, and I really, really love it. It can be very impactful and powerful if it's done right. But if it's just a quick sit-down interview for this type of stuff, especially when it's romance fraud, I have to say the backlash a lot of the times, I think it's just not worth it for victims to do. That is just my opinion. But what are we getting out of it in the end? It's they're getting clicks and ratings, and you're left with no help. That is the reality of it. Yeah.
Sebastian?
I guess for corporate fraud, it's probably the opposite, because especially written media can be very difficult to explain such intricacies of fraud, technicalities of it. Whereas with media, when you have it on the TV show, you can show things that just make it much easier to understand what's happening in the background. And usually it doesn't focus that much on the victims, or sometimes it does, but more on an abstract level. I think it's usually not as intimate as it is in Cecilie's case. So what I found, the documentaries that I saw about some of the large fraud cases, they're actually done really well and very informative. And actually, and maybe that's what allows journalists, because they have more time, they can also talk about the repercussions, like what should we do? So, and that more on a systemic level, what can actually be done about it to prevent it in the future. And then I often feel like in a newspaper articles, sometimes they're as short as 3-5 lines, right? You can't really convey that much information in those, especially not all the technicalities. And maybe you can focus on one victim, or just put some huge numbers in there just to get the feeling across. But in a different medium, you can convey different emotions and different ideas much better. But like from an academic perspective, we know very little about this. It's a field that's basically untapped right now, and it's very interesting. And we're just starting to look into that.
Yeah, because that's what I mean when we talk about the written. Because I totally agree with you that these tabloid articles where there are just so little information, just the bare bone facts, and then you're done, and you don't go into actually what was the mechanism, why it happened in the first place, So I think then I totally agree with you, because that's why I'm quite happy that the documentaries that was made in my case was really well made. The only thing I was missing is that since there are 2 documentaries, so when the second one was going to be made, I was like, now we're going to be investigative, we're going to go to the banks, and we're going to go to the police. And then they just looked at me and said to me, who told you it was going to be an investigative documentary? And I was like, no. So it's kind of the story being told again. I was like, well, I've already told it once. Do I have to, go through, exactly the same thing about, the love and the love you felt for him. And it is very, very draining to have to go back to that time all the time again. And but I think why I'm saying that I can always tell my story again and again, because I've done it so much, So for a lot of new victims that are coming in, they might just be able to just tell it once, and then they're too drained, or they have a bad experience with the journalist as well. We have a lot of them that are, tell that it's going to be this huge piece, and then it gets shortened and shortened and shortened before it goes live on air. That has happened so much with romance fraud, because it always are the one thing that gets cut down before it goes live on air. I'm talking now more about live TV, these short segments on breakfast show. It's never they always use it as filling, it's never the main story. So that is, I think, because they don't really realize how big it actually is. I think that's...
Yeah, but it's amazing how we have all those different kinds of media where we can, or this different kind of ways of getting that message across. Like, we had print media for a long time, but now we have all those different ways. Like, especially social media has been so instrumental also for fraud, and also it's a different way for journalists to get messages across. Like, from research that there's on social media, of course, different things are repeated, tweeted, retweeted differently. And what we see is that when journalists tweet something, that's repeated much more often than other tweets, usually, when it comes to those cases. So they do have some power there as well. And they can get shorter, different messages across. So I think it's very interesting to see how the different kinds of media are used for maybe different messages. Like in your case with the documentary, there's just this way of doing this very in-depth. And then I'm sorry to hear that the second one isn't about investigating, because that's what it would be so suited,
I know,
to do.
Yeah, I know, but I just have to realize that, as I said, we were up against some very powerful players, and it's better that the story was told one way. But that's what I mean. Your own personal, as a victim, what you want to be told and what's important for you might not be as important for other people, or that they would want to click them. Because we had a huge issue with the name Tinder Swindler, because we were like, well, he was defrauding everywhere. Why, But the thing is that it is catchy, and I can be negative, that why did we pick that, or the journalist, it was in Norway that picked that. So I was like, why? That sounds so, horrible. But it's us that are clicking in. It's us as people who like it, So even though I, as a person, as a victim, might not be happy about the wording of that, I get it. We understand that sometimes you have to have a certain narrative for people to actually watch it. Yeah. But I just wish that there were more, as I said, I just see all the time that the moment I mention kind of more in-depth stuff with journalists and others, that's going to cost a lot of money and time, I'm like, damn, and it just stops there. And then of course it's easier to then just tell the story and don't go more in-depth, what happened between the fraudster and the person. Because a lot of people are asking us, why did you do what you did? Instead of asking why Simon did what he did. A lot of the time, that's the questions that's coming back on. If you go on social media and if you see a clip from the Tinder Swindler, you will see, why did she do that? Why did I do that? Instead of asking, how could he do it? And that is a lot of times when it comes to crime, a lot of people believe sometimes the women crime, but this isn't a woman crime, I just think it's so, that's another thing with the media, it's so skewed because all the stories that are out there are just us women coming forward. And I'm like, this is a 50-50 crime. This isn't gendered. I'm all for sticking up, but I feel like for when we go public, then it becomes gendered. That I very clearly, not that I've spoken to so many men who's gone public, because there are so few of them. Yeah. So it's very difficult to speak to them. But I was on an Australian TV show where there was a man who had been defrauded by a woman who had claimed she had cancer and she had taken money from him. And the host asked the guy, what do people say to you after you've been public? Oh, everything was just positive, so much support. And then it was me. And then there's another woman, and the backlash that we have received, from the public, from just being a woman, that either you're blonde, that's blonde and stupid, that comes throwing back to you then, that you're blonde and stupid and naive and gold diggers. Gold diggers is perfect, and even my fraudsters have used that we're gold diggers. So I think then it becomes gendered. And I hate to see that, because I think I would wish more men would want and talk about this. but I think it's just difficult to find. It's difficult that they want to step forward, because I understand.
Yeah.
Look at how we're being portrayed and how we're being laughed at. I get it that the men don't want to come forward as well. It's a shame.
Okay, well, that is all we have time for on this episode. So I'd like to thank Sebastian and Cecilia for joining me today to discuss fraud and the media. And thank you very much, both. My name's Anne-Claire Maillet, and this is Fraudible.